think what the UK has managed to do is kind of make itself the guinea pig on two sides here. And I'm not sure that's a comfortable position to be in.
But there is a way forward, which I do believe is in both the EU and the UK's interests, but it's going to have to be hammered out in detail.
Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking. This is the podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, we're talking about the really tough choices facing the UK as it tries to find its way through this triangle of relationships, the US, China, and the EU, all the while trying to find the stubbornly elusive economic growth that Rachel Reeves wants and the security that many MPs are increasingly worried about. It's not easy. These three global giants make up 2/3 of UK trade, but each relationship comes with demands that jeopardises one of the others. As the UK prepares to host the upcoming UK-EU summit on Monday, there's a bit of hope for deepening cooperation with Europe, at least on security, climate and trade, but some terms of that deal could stymie further talks with the US. A new trade agreement with the US last week, that is a 5-page note of intention rather than a full deal, signalled London's desire to work with the Trump administration where it can, but big differences remain. And the biggest may prove to be over China, where the UK faces a dilemma. It wants trade and investment, but it's concerned about security, and it's watching nervously as the US and China feel their way down from eye-watering mutual tariffs to something a bit less dramatic but still damaging. Will the US ask the UK explicitly to join its side? Well, to help pick at least one course through these waters, I'm joined by Janka Oertel from the European Council on Foreign Relations and Sir Martin Donnelly, former Permanent Secretary at the UK Department for International Trade. Welcome. Martin, let me start with you. We're going to start with the UK and the EU. You spent 25 years working on economic and trade issues for the British government. You wrote a paper for the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, just before Christmas on exactly this point of the hard choices the UK faces. And the UK summit with the EU is on Monday. Both sides are talking about more cooperation, but the EU's been stalling on all kinds of things like letting the UK have access to intelligence and migration databases, and fish keep appearing. So what should we expect?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. I guess the EU would argue that they were simply trying to ensure that the deal that came out was equally balanced and respected existing EU rules. And I think one of the challenges is we have to overcome the legacy of a considerable number of years of mistrust and concerns on both sides. On the UK side, that the EU wasn't treating the decisions after Brexit seriously, and on the EU side, that the UK simply wanted to cherry pick and retain all of its ability to do whatever it wanted. So I think what we need to see now is a rebuilding of trust. And I think that will happen because of the clear shared need for a defence and security relationship, which can to some extent make up, certainly over time, for the uncertainty around the US commitment to Europe, certainly in defensive terms. And secondly, because the values that are shared between the European Union and Britain, and we might come on to this in more detail, are also important to both. And frankly, we need to work with each other. So if we can build on that basis, we can get into the difficult and inevitably complex negotiations about phytosanitary rules, about a relationship with fish, about building up a system where we can move towards dynamic alignment of UK rules with the EU in agreed sectors and so on. That process is going to take time and be difficult, but we can start it next week.
Martin, that's a marvellously strategic and diplomatic answer, worthy of the very top of your former profession. But where do you think they've got to now?
I'm not sure how far they've got, honestly. I worry that we're not quite there yet in terms of the point you made at the beginning, Bronwen. I think there are people in Whitehall or Westminster who feel the EU is not being sympathetic enough, and there are people in Brussels who think the UK is hot on rhetoric, but not very clear on what it's prepared to offer for a genuinely win-win agreement. So I think we're going to have to go through a difficult period of adjustment so people can see that they're not going to get everything they want, but there is a way forward, which I do believe is in both the EU and the UK's interests. But it's going to have to be hammered out in detail. It's not going to happen next week at the declaratory level. This is about getting down to all of the stuff we've spent so many years negotiating when we were together in the EU, because the detail really matters.
Janka, let me turn to you. You're the head of Asia at the ECFR and spent a lot of time looking at the EU and China, including at a brilliant roundtable I was at very recently. So let's take Martin's suggestion and look at the UK relationship from the European side. How important is the UK as a trading partner to Europe?
UK is more and will be more than a trading partner for Europe all the time, but it is a complex relationship at the moment. And maybe let me just start with something slightly provocative, but the actions taken in signing or sort of signing on to a preliminary deal with the United States has actually made the life for the Europeans harder. Not only because this is something that they will be hearing from the US now and will be saying, look, the UK has signed on to this, these are the conditions, but also because they've basically signed off on the 10%, and that as a trade surplus country and not as a trade deficit country. So what does that bode for all the others? And at the same time, with on top of that, the Geneva kind of de-escalation, as I would call it, between the US and China, the EU is now in a difficult situation because China is under less pressure, the US is under less pressure, and the US will come to Europe and say, look at what the UK did. This is great. This is the baseline of what we're looking at. So I would think the kind of atmosphere in Brussels might not be particularly conducive for fantastic conversations with the UK right now.
Do you think the UK made the wrong choice in pushing ahead for that deal? There's obviously this big scramble going on in Washington for every country to try and do a deal.
Yeah, I think, there is an upside for this to the UK, but there's obviously, as you were saying, difficult choices and trade-offs that are being paid. There is a version of this kind of negotiation where Europe, with the EU, with the UK, with Japan, where everyone's sort of standing together, coordinating closely and coordinating their positions to sort of maximally push back against US demands. That is now not happening. The UK has sort of left that coalition, at least temporarily. And I think that's something that might come back to haunt them later. We don't know. It could be good to be first in line. With the Trump administration, it's hard to say, but it's a call that the UK administration made. And I think this is something that they will have to live with, whatever the outcome will be.
Just on the economic front, we're talking quite a bit about security, and obviously that's one of the UK's strongest cards in cooperation with Europe. But just on the economic point, Martin, how much is at stake for the UK, given it's not about, as the government keeps telling us, to rejoin the European Union? So how much is at stake in economic growth, which the Chancellor so desperately wants to find?
Well, it is absolutely the priority area for UK growth, because the European Union and the countries tied in closely to it remain by far the major market for goods and for services, and also, although this has fallen off by nearly 20% since Brexit, for inward investment. The UK cannot flourish without a close trade, investment and regulatory relationship with its nearest neighbours. That's what the figures tell us. Now, that doesn't mean the US and China are not important as well, and the three of them together are 2/3 of UK's total trade. But the EU is by some way the largest trading partner, and that is not going to change if the UK wants to grow.
Martin, can I just press this point? In your view, it is indisputably more important than the relationship with the US.
In economic and trade terms, that's what the figures show us. Yes, absolutely. By a long way, in goods, in services, on the supply chains that we've built up over the decades. That's just the reality. And, rhetoric doesn't change it. So we need the EU more, of course, than the EU needs us, but it's also not unimportant for many European countries and for many sectors, including agriculture, the whole pharma areas. Indeed, still areas like automotive are important. So there's no getting away from the fact that this is the key relationship for the United Kingdom if you want sustainable growth.
Do you think the UK government made a mistake in going ahead with the US deal first?
No, because, and I'm not sure if I slightly differ, Janka, from you on this. I'm not sure I do. I think that the UK government was sensibly exploring all the options with the US. And as you said, Bronwen, at the beginning, we don't actually have a trade agreement, still less a treaty.
No, we have 5 sides of paper, which include the phrase, this is not binding.
Exactly. And we know from this administration that when they say it's not binding, that's what they mean.
Even sometimes when it does say it's binding, it turns out not to be.
That's what the Canadians and Mexicans might think, among others. Yes. So, I think, though, when push comes to shove, to have the relationship we need with Europe, we have to avoid the trap that Janka was talking about. We must not allow the UK to be presented as somehow a Trojan horse against Europe or a divide and rule approach. And of course, we've also seen the Chinese expressing some concern about some of the wording in that 5-page piece of text.
I think what the UK has managed to do is kind of make itself the guinea pig on two sides here. And I'm not sure that's a comfortable position to be in.
No, I think that you're right. And we have to be very careful of that, which is, I think, why we need to have this discussion on a wider basis. It's very important for the UK because we are smaller than those three blocks.
A small guinea pig. We're going to come on to the US and China in sequence, but just sticking for a final point on the EU and trying for a bit more optimism. Obviously, there are some clear points of common interest there. One is defence and security. What is the best you think we can hope for, let's call it over the course of this year? There's obviously a lot of goodwill on both UK and EU side in principle. Before you get down to the detail, whether it is fish or something else, there is goodwill there. What could we hope for?
Well, I'd say that we can certainly expect to see close cooperation on the development of a European security defence industry so that we are sharing funding in various ways, including possibly through new financing mechanisms, that we're trying to avoid duplication, because we all know the clock is ticking for Europe to do more on its own defence, and we can't afford to waste this opportunity. Second, I'd say there is scope now that the government is making clear, as I understand it, that they are prepared to follow European Union law when necessary. In areas like plant and animal health and food and so on, we can extend that to medicines and so on. We can show that the UK will follow EU rules and accept judgments ultimately of the European Court of Justice. And that opens up a lot more areas for detailed agreement, which will improve the trade and investment relationship. And we can start working on those now. They will not be easy, and they will need trade-offs into politically sensitive sectors like fish, but that can be done.
Janka, what's your sense of optimism here and just the position, even if from a long lens, of the UK and the EU? Are they really back on some kind of terms?
I sit here in Berlin. We just have a new chancellor. And I do think those images that we were seeing over the last few days of sort of Merz, Macron, Tusk, and Starmer traveling to Kiev together, those are the images, I think, of the kind of Europe that also the new German chancellor imagines. For him, Europe is like London is part of Europe. The UK is part of Europe in his kind of idea of what Europe can be in this new order and in this new world. So I think there will at least be a lot of support from Germany to foster this relationship. I think the times have changed, and maybe the bickering over fish is not adequate to the urgency of the challenges that we face.
And just one more point on that, just on your own view of where Europe is going to go. Yes, we saw the four of them very powerfully in sort of semi-casual gear, sitting in a train carriage or facing each other. Is that what Europe is really going to be most effectively? Is coalitions of the willing, getting on trains together, making their own deals, sort of dragging the rest of Europe behind?
I think that depends on the sector that you look at, because I think on Ukraine right now, that is probably the most powerful image that we can generate. But on trade, for example, when it comes to outside of the intra-European conversation with regard to China, I don't want those four to do that. You know, I would like to have Ursula von der Leyen in the lead because she's having a very sensible approach at the moment, and has the whole power of the single market behind her, and can only be like complemented then with other countries that take a similar approach. So I do think it really depends on what you're talking about, which area we're talking about. When it comes to sort of defending Europe's prosperity, then I think Brussels will have a major role to play.
I agree with that. And you can't do deals on pharmaceuticals or chemicals or phytosanitary rules with four leaders. That's not how it works. And everybody has to recognize that. But we can channel that political will into detailed negotiations.
Okay, Martin, we've taken your lead and given both of you and given your disproportionate weight here because it is the most important. I'm embracing that point. But let's wheel round to the US and to this trade agreement in name that was done. Janka, where do you think that goes from here, the UK-US deal? And do you see any conflict with where the UK wants to take its relationship with the EU? And I'm thinking particularly of data and digital.
I see a lot of conflicts in that agreement that I wouldn't necessarily call a deal. I think we all have to be very careful with our language at the moment, because whenever we call something a deal, we're kind of inherently handing a victory to Donald Trump. So I would be very careful calling things a deal that are not a deal. So this kind of preliminary agreement that we're seeing here has some sort of catchy phrases in it that are potentially problematic. And I think one of them I already named, the 10%, but there is a whole section on economic security as well that is very much China focused. So there's a few things that are being locked in there that I think could be problematic, and where, for example, Beijing will react to this, as we have seen. They've already kind of positioned themselves and are trying to scare the UK. It's much easier to scare the UK than to scare the EU right now. This is why I'm like, brings me back to the guinea pig situation, because if you're in Beijing right now, you don't want to immediately take on the entirety of the EU. But if you can sort of play the UK card and use that as an example of showing that you will be tough on this, it will not only send a message to Brussels, but also to the rest of the world in terms of which kinds of deals and agreements are being signed with the US and what the response of Beijing will be. So I do think that this needs some really careful thought about where the UK wants to position itself. And I was just really surprised, because I would have thought for the UK, it's a huge advantage of doing these things in collaboration with partners, because you don't want to be called out and singled out on this. This is why I found it slightly surprising. I would have thought that, being in line and sort of in a united front, particularly with the EU and Japan, would have made a lot of sense for the UK. And I don't see the huge advantage of being first right now.
Except that, in a sense, there's such a sort of fever around what Trump is doing at the moment, and countries so desperate not to be hit with tariffs and to get some reprieve in the tariffs they have been hit with, that I can understand the jostling to get in there. Martin, your view, a good non-deal or a bad non-deal?
I think a good step forward, but there are dangers in taking...
Why I wouldn't make a civil servant. Yes.
Look, I think it's important that we engage with the United States. Of course it is, not least for the security and defense relationship that is still critical, but also for investment, for work together on innovative sectors, on tech and so on. We need to connect more with what's happening across the United States, frequently, though outside Washington, in states, and not just the West Coast and the Northeast, but increasingly, in Georgia, outside Chicago, the new areas of innovation. And that requires a positive political climate. I think, though, and I do agree very much with what Janka said, we have to be aware that the environment we're in for the next nearly 4 years is one where no trade deals will be stable. And we have to be extremely clear what our red lines are. So if we are asked, for example, to change companies' diversity or inclusion policies in order to get access to US contracts or markets, we have to know what we're going to say. And it's much more sensible to say that together with the European Union, Japan, others, Australia and Canada and so on, than try to do it by ourselves. So I think as you go into this, you have to know what's negotiable and what isn't. And it really is a good idea to do this in parallel with your other friends and allies.
Martin, that's a very strong statement to say that no trade deal will be stable. What about the one the UK has just done with India?
Sorry, I meant with the United States.
With the US.
States.
Fine.
Yeah.
Fine. So let me ask you both, though, just on one particular point of this, which is about tech and digital. The US has not liked the way that Europe is going on digital governance of all kinds, saying, look, you're regulating all the creativity out of it. Doesn't like the UK's digital tax. And that's not just the tech people around Trump, though they are muttering to him, you haven't delivered to us the reprieve from all these terrible European taxes and regulations that you implicitly promised us. Where do you see this going? Is this a real conflict that could blow up? Because it wasn't in that 5-page agreement. Janka, what do you think?
I can just speak for the EU side better here, but for the EU side, that is a red line. The Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, that will not be touched. The EU has been very explicit and very clear about this. So I think this is going to be a precondition for any other conversation. Then this is going to get ugly. Let's
just wheel around again then and pick up the question of the UK and China. And in some ways, this is one of the hardest ones. I was just upstairs editing an excellent report by our very own William Matthews that's about to come out on this and the choices the UK faces there. But in your view, what is the hardest decision the UK faces in relation to China?
So for me, the question is how much Chinese investment is going to be allowed into the UK and how much Chinese technology. I call myself a veteran of the 5G conversation. It feels ages ago, but it was the first Trump administration. And it does feel like everyone has a bit of like post-traumatic stress syndrome now because we're all feeling like thrown back into that time. But the questions are real. The questions about solar inverters, the question about wind turbines, the question about connected vehicles. the choices that are being made will lock in the UK for a really long time, and it will lock in European countries for a really long time. And we are in the same situation right now in the EU, where the question of greenfield investment from China is going to be the key question. That is our soft underbelly. China cannot offer a lot right now. They can't offer a lot of market access. They can't offer a lot of market shares in China. That just doesn't work right now because of the state of the Chinese economy and because of the state of the global economy at the moment. So for China, the only thing that they can really give would be foreign direct investments, would be greenfield investment and production in Europe.
Okay, so what's the difficulty for the UK in this? Because someone offering you investment, particularly in leading technology, sounds like a great thing. Is it the security point? Could China turn off wind farms at the click of a switch or a click of a mouse or whatever? Or is it that is the strict security point? Or is it the fact that this cheap Chinese stuff, in which China has a world lead, would either undermine what the UK has in the way of an industry or stop the UK ever developing one?
I think there are three aspects to this for me, if that's okay if I answer it really briefly. But for
Sure.
me, there are three things to this. The one is the national security aspect that just shouldn't be underestimated, where I think the UK is in an excellent position to assess this and has been in an excellent position before, and where I see the kind of political conversation ongoing. I think that's absolutely crucial. The second dimension is, what is the perspective for these industries? From a Chinese perspective, dominance in these industries is the key goal of the Chinese leadership. This is not about some fun and great competition under free market conditions, but this is actually about dominating structures because it enhances China's national security. There is a clear understanding as well that technology transfer is not something that the Chinese leadership is particularly keen on right now. To give away a lot of the kind of great technologies that have been developed in China is not in the books right now. So if that's not the plan right now, then this leaves us with sort of final assembly. And that brings me to the third point, that you generate a lot of political dependency. As I've said before, but how many factories does Tesla have in China? It's just one, but it has changed the entire game. And we can generate a lot of political dependency on China if crucial sectors are literally just invested in by Chinese companies that can be pulled out as well.
Can you just spell out for us why that's changed the game?
Because for us, if you have a company in Northern England, for example, then that's something when you assume that company wants to be running by economic conditions and want good market conditions, that's one thing. But if that company can be politically used and said, unfortunately, we don't need that investment anymore, we'll just pull it out right now. You are politically dependent on that player. And I think so therefore you need to have the balance really right in terms of not having too much dependency. And again, on tech transfer and that question of how can you control the amount of investment coming in, strength in numbers is really important. So negotiating things like that together for the Europeans means this should be negotiated at the European level. Foreign direct investments, though, are a prerogative of the member states. And so this is something that is also challenging in the EU. Therefore, I think this needs a broader conversation about what are the framework conditions for Chinese investments in key future industries, all the clean tech sectors, all the technology sectors that Europeans want.
Martin, how on earth does the UK get this right? This government, the previous one, said versions of the same thing. Well, we want to protect ourselves, obviously, but we definitely want to trade with them. And we want to talk about big picture problems of the world like climate change. And then they go round and round that triangle. Or maybe some governments put a bit more weight on security and others on a bit more on growth. But they're not wrong. There are those three elements. How do you, in any sense, get it right?
Well, I think you have to start by deciding on the level of risk you're prepared to accept as against the opportunities. And I think I'd be a touch more positive on that, because I totally agree on national security and we mustn't be naive. However, there's a vast number of areas where the Chinese economy has the capacity to engage with our own, and we can manage that securely, as we did in the case of Huawei until the politics got in the way. I think also Chinese companies...
Politics got in the way in what way? In letting Huawei in or throwing it out?
Throwing it out. There was no security case ever really made for throwing it out, nor did the things we replaced it with actually look any more secure. So that was ultimately a political decision made under pressure.
Interesting
from the
point.
United States.
Yes. There are many views on that.
Well,
Sorry, go on.
I think that is what the experts now tend to say. But I just say, look, we can allow investment in market areas. We can ensure that we build up mutual supply chains. We have to be aware of risks. But I think for most of the sectors, most of the time, there is a win-win which we can manage while keeping an eye on. And the other way around, China's got well over 100 cities with more than 1 million people. The services that we can provide, professional, business, financial, insurance, and education, are very important to the next stage of Chinese development, and we need to be more engaged. But when we've made our decision about that risk management framework, we've then got to stick to it. And I think my final point would be, we must tell businesses, if you work in this way or you want to invest here in these terms, that's fine, and you'll be looked after like everybody else. We can't go on shifting every 2 or 3 years. That doesn't work.
Yeah, though China itself shifts, I think we have to acknowledge, and has shifted itself in its approach to the world since David Cameron's golden era. So it isn't just us moving around the place. And every chancellor I can think of who's gone to China has taken a plane load of British business people with them. You've been talking about security there, that in this particular definition of the security threat, if you like. What about the most recent case of Scunthorpe, of trying to protect an industry, a struggling industry, but one that suddenly at the last minute we thought we remembered that we needed, or worked out that we might need? What do you do about that? How does the UK make that decision?
Well, I'm afraid if you look at what we've been doing on steel, we haven't in the past argued that we have to keep a particular sort of blast furnace going, particularly not ones that are 60 years old. We have been looking to move towards greener steel production. The arguments about security in relation to Scunthorpe don't really add up, I'm afraid. And what you have is a loss-making industry. It happened to be owned by a Chinese company. It's been owned by others before. This is, I'm afraid, about harsh commercial reality. The UK will have to decide how much of a steel industry it is prepared to subsidize and for how long. And that, incidentally, could raise state aid issues with our European and other friends. But it isn't a serious national security issue.
Janka, does this look different from a European perspective? Because Europe is trying to defend against Chinese competition, manufacturing base, which is rather fragile, but I'm thinking of the electric vehicle industry and so on. It may only have a couple of years to defend this, but it is trying.
Well, we have an industry to defend, for one, and that is really important. And I do think that we have to look a bit more differentiated in this and very nuanced. What kind of industries, and I think that's the right question to ask, what kind of industries do we want to keep? What kind of industries do we think from a prosperity perspective, from innovation perspective, from a security perspective, do we need in Europe? And we have to start from there. If in these industries, China has massive competitive companies, then if we keep our market open, we will not have a fair competition for a long time, because Chinese companies can offer their products at a markdown that we cannot possibly deal with at the European level. This is why we have put tariffs on the electric vehicle sector, but this is why we have to think through what the framework could look like. It's very hard to get to conditions that we've had, for example, with Japan, 70s, 80s, the conversation about restrictions and certain sort of what are the amounts of vehicles that can come in. That's really difficult to negotiate from a position of weakness. So how do you generate leverage first and generate a position of strength first in which you can actually enter in these kinds of negotiations? I think the vision for the European EV industry would be that the EU becomes one of the most competitive markets in which European, Japanese, Korean, American, and Chinese cars can compete against each other for high value and low prices. But I think that's one thing where I, for once, have to agree with Elon Musk, and I will do that very, very carefully because I don't normally do that. But as he said, if you don't do anything about it, there will be no competition in this space. There will be only Chinese dominance. And that's absolutely correct if you look at the figures right now and how quickly this development takes place. So I think this is the reality that we're facing right now, is that if we don't do something about the framework conditions, we will not have many choices left. And we have sacrificed other industries before for our interests in China. Germany, the solar industry, the telecoms industry is another really good example in which we have sacrificed a lot of kind of market losses for other industries in China. And now that market shares for our car companies are plummeting, I do think that you've probably all seen the headlines of how little European companies expect to sell in the future in the Chinese market. I also have my doubts in the services sector because of the way that the Chinese economy is structured right now. So I think we have to maybe shed the illusion of the potential that the Chinese market has for us and put on the very realistic glasses that say, what if there is no place for European companies in the Chinese market in the foreseeable future? How does that change our calculation for how much of a role China should play in our market?
I must say, I lean towards your caution rather than Martin's earlier, what sounded like optimism about services. I didn't challenge you on that. We're coming right to the end. Let me ask you, both of you, one question which comes back to the guinea pig in the middle. Is Britain trying to have it always at once? And if so, is it doing it successfully? I find the word cakeism has sort of detached itself from the Boris Johnson premiership and now attaches itself in the eyes of critics to British foreign policy overall, trying to have it always at once with the risk that you're not close to any. Martin, what do you think?
I think you have to be strategic. And if I can just briefly add on China, I'd say I was cautiously optimistic. China is part of the world economy. There are a lot of opportunities for the UK. We're behind France, Germany, and other countries in our connection with the Chinese market. We can do more for our prosperity while not being naive about this. But otherwise, we need to invest more in research, in innovation. We need to develop the industries of the future together, and we need to be careful about intellectual property. But there aren't in this world any easy or cheap wins. And there is the danger, to go back to where we started from, Bronwen, of being shut out by the three big trade blocs if we're not careful.
And by being careful, do you mean making choices? What do you mean by being careful?
I mean, we have got...
You're being very careful, but what does this mean for the UK?
I think what it means is ultimately you have to be closest to the people that you share values with. And it happens to be the European Union, which is also our biggest market. So it makes sense for us not to get too far from the European Union in dealing with these issues, and certainly to deepen the dialogue on them, so that if we have different views, we're having them within a shared framework of values and a way forward.
I think at a time where the Trump administration is weaponizing the security relationship with Europe, where the Chinese leadership is weaponizing its economic relationship by restricting access to critical raw materials, etc., I think this is a really good time to choose those that don't try to weaponize their relationship with you. And so I would agree. I would say that there is a lot to be gained from a close UK-EU relationship at this point in time, because the framework conditions from the times of Brexit, from the times before, have changed so radically. And I think really not waking up to that reality will not only risk sort of falling through the cracks, but falling into economic irrelevance and into a situation in which the choices for the UK are not going to be more, but less in the future, and where more things are going to be decided for the UK instead of by the UK. And I think that's a situation that I would want to avoid if I were sitting in London.
Okay, we've got two votes there, in a sense, for closer relations with Europe. I would just say I was in a discussion very recently in the city with a crowd of people who very much had regretted Brexit, but there was still a substantial constituency saying, look, the US is still an extraordinary place, an extraordinary market, extraordinary innovation, okay, extraordinary politics, very extraordinary president at the moment, but not somewhere to cut ourselves off from. So conscious of the other flank of this conversation, which is a long one, but we're going to have to stop right here. Thank you both so much. That's Janka, Oertel and Martin Donnelly. And if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please do leave us a review. It's always helpful. It's always interesting. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.